Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our clinical trials webinar here at Kidney Cancer Canada. My name is Stephen Andrew. I'm going to be your moderator for today. And we have a number of people. We welcome you across Canada and from around the world today joining us for this webinar, which will take place for about an hour. We have Dr. Denny Heng joining us from Calgary in just a little bit. So let's just go through how today is going to operate. First of all, just a little bit of an overview. We'll do a brief introduction to Kidney Cancer Canada. We'll have the panelist presentations, question and answers, and then a very brief wrap-up. So Kidney Cancer Canada is a national organization of patients, survivors, caregivers, and health professionals that work to provide support, education, and advocacy for kidney cancer patients and their families in Canada. Through peer support, we have a person-to-person peer support. You just can log on to kidneycancercanada.ca or to call us on our toll-free number, which we'll give you later. We also have an online forum, which people participate in on a regular basis. And, of course, there's our website, kidneycancercanada.ca. We also provide information. We do that through our website, also publications, and we have patient and caregiver forums, which we'll tell you a little bit about later, and, of course, webinars, such as the one we're about to have in just a little while. And our position on advocacy is that every kidney cancer patient deserves access to quality treatments. And we teach patients how to advocate for their personal needs to make their voices heard in the healthcare system. So if you want more information on Kidney Cancer Canada, located under handouts, and you'll find that just to the right of your screen, download the brochure that says about Kidney Cancer Canada, and there'll be a lot more information there. Now, that's enough information about us. We'd like to know a little bit about you today. So we have a couple of questions for you, and they're polling questions. If you could click on the response that's most appropriate, that would be the easiest way to doing it, just to get us started and using the technology. So for question number one, here it comes. I hope that we're going to work. Yeah. Can you tell us, which of the following are you? Are you a patient? Are you a caregiver or others? If you could answer that question now for us, just by clicking on one of those answers. Okay. And we'll now move on to our next question. Can you tell us what your status of your kidney cancer is, if you know? Is it stage 1, stage 2? That next one is meant to be stage 3, the third item on there, stage 4, or I don't know. So in the order they are is 1, 2, 3, 4, or I don't know. Just give you a couple of minutes to look at the answer on that. Would you be able to show us the answer to that one, Mona?
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay. Mona's joining us, by the way, from Montreal today. Mona is our communications lead. Okay, so the answer's coming up. Oh, did we lose that?
I'm going to let it. I'm going to tell you. It's 67% stage 4, 6% stage 3, 3% stage 2, and 9% stage 1.
Oh, thank you very much. That gives us an idea of who we're talking to today. And do we have another question? Yeah. Has your doctor ever discussed clinical trials with you? Yes or no? Yes or no? And we'll give you an answer on that. as well. We'll tell you what the general opinion is on that. Yes or no? Okay.
69%, well, 72% yes, and 26% no.
Okay. And our next final question is, have you ever participated in a clinical trial? Have you ever participated in a clinical trial? Yes or no?
%69 no, 31% yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mona. Okay, so now joining us from Calgary is Dr. Daniel Heng. He's an oncologist in Calgary, and he's going to start his camera for us now. And his microphone. Are you there, Dr. Heng?
Hi, everyone.
Okay. And hi, welcome. So what I'm going to do is give you control of the slide presentation and take it away. Thanks for joining us.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all of the participants. It looks like there's a lot of participation tonight, so that's fantastic. I'm Danny Heng. I'm one of the medical oncologists at the Tom Baker Cancer Center, and I have a special interest in kidney cancer, and I do a lot of research in kidney cancer. And so I have a slide presentation to show you, but I don't want it to occupy the whole time. I definitely want to leave a lot of room for discussion. And so I'm just looking to see if I have control over the slides. If you could send over control to me, that would be great. We also have Deb Maskens on the line as well, and she'll join us as a panelist to talk about clinical trials from a patient's perspective, and we'll have some things to discuss there as well. Great. So that's my title slide there. So I'm the chair of the GU tumor group at the Tom Baker Cancer Center here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. All right, next slide. So a brief outline, we'll talk about renal cell carcinoma and a brief background. We'll talk about clinical trials in very easy terms to understand, as well as go over definitions, because I realize that we use a lot of jargon that we shouldn't be using, and so I just want to clear those up as much as possible. I want to talk about how clinical trials work, accessing clinical trials, and then afterwards we'll spend a lot of time on a discussion Q&A. So next slide, please. So renal cell carcinoma, this is the only fancy slide I'm going to show you, so don't worry, the whole presentation isn't like this. The whole point of this slide is to show you that cancer is very complex. And you'll see on this side over the pink cell here, this is a blood vessel cell. A blue cell here, this is an immune system, your own immune system cells. And this big tan colored cell is the tumor cell, so the kidney cancer cell. And kidney cancer is made up of millions and millions, billions of cells like this. And what we've been able to do is look at different targets on the cell or on the blood vessels or on T cells in the immune system. And we have found targets to try to attack. And by attacking those targets, we can reduce the amount the kidney cancer grows. We can actually use the immune system to rev it up so that your own immune system attacks the tumor cell. Or we could cut off the blood supply to the tumor cell so that there's no oxygen, nutrients, or minerals delivered to the tumor cells. So those are all of the different ways we treat metastatic renal cell carcinoma, stage 4 metastatic kidney cancer, or kidney cancer that's moved on to other places other than the kidney. So, you can see that a lot is going on. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that not too long ago, next slide, we didn't have these treatments. And so if you were to look back in, oh, sorry, if you could go back one slide. If you were to look back, before 2005, all we had were these drugs, high dose interleukin-2, interferon A, and they were really not good. The best response rates were probably in the range of 15%, and they made people feel really crappy, and people didn't have a good quality of life. But thankfully, as the years passed, you can see from 2005 till 2016, over the past 10 years, there's been an explosion of new drugs that haven't been there before, and now we have the opportunity to use them. Thankfully, we have a lot of experience using these drugs now, and we see great responses. And so we're really lucky to be able to say that, for people with metastatic kidney cancer, we're able to use these drugs really well. We're able to control the disease much better than we used to. Definitely, we have a long way to go. We have more research to do. And so these are some potential future drugs that are coming down the pipeline, maybe in the next few years. And you can see it's much more crowded here than it is over here. So you can see the future is bright for kidney cancer patients. There are lots of new drugs being developed and lots of clinical trials ongoing to see and prove whether or not those drugs really are effective or not. So what are clinical trials? Why are they important? So let's go over clinical trials a little bit. So I want to talk to you about some of the very first clinical studies ever documented. These are interesting facts for geeky people like me. They may or may not be interesting to people like you. But in 1600 AD, there were some observational studies about scurvy. So scurvy afflicted people because of vitamin C deficiency. If you are on a boat for a very long time, sailing across the ocean, you might not have access to vitamin C, and so you get scurvy. And so they noticed that when they sent 4 ships out and provided one of those ships with lemon juice, they didn't know what it was for, only that ship with lemon juice was free of scurvy. So that's some observational data to tell us, oh, maybe there's something to lemon juice. It's not perfect data though, because what if, the lemon juice was also associated with, that boat having a lot more money, or that boat having a lot healthier people on board, they're going to do better. And so that's why we need clinical trials to prove that really it's lemon juice that's helpful. So in 1747 AD, the very first clinical trial that's ever documented was by James Lind. He was on board a ship aboard the Salisbury ship at sea, and there were 12 patients with scurvy, and the cases were as similar as he could have found them. And so he talked about these inclusion criteria. They had scurvy, they were all on board, and they were all similar to each other. And then he randomized those 12 patients. 2 of those patients were given just some cider once a day. 2 of those patients were given this magical elixir. 2 other patients were given vinegar, and 2 other patients were given seawater, and 2 other patients were given oranges and lemons, which have vitamin C, obviously. And so they followed these patients, and then they found that the most sudden and visible good effects were seen in those people with oranges and lemons. So this is a randomized controlled trial showing that people getting oranges and lemons or vitamin C, you can prevent scurvy or treat scurvy, and that's what it showed here. So this is basically a clinical trial. It had inclusion criteria, people were randomized, and there were outcomes reported. And I'll go over those terms in just a bit. So clinical trials, I know Stephen just did a poll about clinical trials and how many people have been asked to do clinical trials and stuff like that. And so a while ago, Kidney Cancer Canada asked their audience, did your doctor discuss any clinical trials that might be open for you? And only 24% of people said yes, 45% said no, and others weren't sure. Have you ever enrolled in a clinical trial related to your kidney cancer? Surprisingly, 20% said yes. So 20% is actually a very decent number. So across the United States, for example, that 20% number is more like 5%, which shows you that Canada really is a leader in clinical trial accrual and trying to answer important questions with clinical trials. So I've given you a bit of an introduction to metastatic kidney cancer, or kidney cancer in general, and the drugs and how they've come to be and some of the earliest clinical trials. But let me go over some definitions and the mechanisms of clinical trials. So a clinical trial is a study looking at whether or not one intervention is better than another intervention. It's done in humans, it's done in patients with the disease of interest, or in this case, kidney cancer or metastatic kidney cancer. There are lots of different adjectives that you can throw around clinical trials. Is it single-armed or is it randomized? So a single-arm clinical trial means that the clinical trial only has one group of patients and they all get the same treatment and they're followed. Those are usually phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials. And there's no comparator arm because really they're just seeing, is there any benefit at all potentially to this drug? We're not worried about comparing it to standard of care yet. We just want to see whether or not there's any exciting glimmer of hope benefit. Or is it a randomized trial? And a randomized trial is where there are 2 arms or maybe 3 arms, where half of the people get randomized to one group of treatments and the other half of patients get randomized to another group of patients. So that's usually in a trial where there's 2 arms, 3 arms, or 2 different treatment options, 3 different treatment options. Then clinical trials can be blinded or open label. So if there's if there's 2 or more arms in a clinical trial, people are either blinded, i.e. they don't know what they're getting. They're either getting drug A or drug B and only the computer knows, the physician doesn't know, the patient doesn't know, the statistician doesn't know, only the computer knows whether or not you're getting that drug. Or open label. Open label means you know what you're getting. If you're randomized to drug A, you know you're getting drug A. If you're randomized to drug B, you know you're getting drug B. Why do we do that? We blind patients because it's really important to avoid bias. Because if you can imagine, if you were on the exciting new experimental arm and you knew it, you would probably feel better about it. You'd probably eat better, you'd probably feel better, you'd probably exercise more, and those little things, and your doctor might even treat you better if he knew that you were on the new sexy investigational arm. And so we want to avoid that by blinding people so that people don't get preferential treatment, so that people are treated exactly the same and really the only difference in outcome is because of the drug itself. Why are some trials open label? Some trials are open label because maybe it's too hard to create blinding. Maybe it's too hard to hide the fact that you're on drug A or drug B. A good example of that is if you have an IV drug, a drug that goes through the IV, through your vein, or if you have a pill, you're going to know if you're on a pill or an IV. So there's no point blinding something like that. You might as well make it open label. There's also control arms, placebo controls or standard of care controls. And so, in large clinical trials, what they want to do is to see whether or not the new drug, drug A, is better than what we're currently doing. And if what we're currently doing is drug B, then the clinical trial will be drug A versus drug B. And that would be your randomized controlled trial because you're comparing against a control, your standard of care. Where placebos come in, so not all trials have placebos, where placebos come in is if the standard of care is nothing. So let's say, for example, if you had a patient who had a kidney cancer that was localized, stage 1, and you took it out of the body with surgery, the standard of care is actually nothing. We just do CT scans every once in a while to make sure that everything is okay. And so that's why in clinical trials such as that, they have a placebo control or a standard of care control arm to compare whether or not adding drug A versus that placebo control or standard of care arm is better or not. We can talk more about that later as well. There's also phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials. And so, you know, if you see a clinical trial, you might notice that it says it's phase 1, or it's a phase 2 trial, or phase 3 trial, or phase 4 trial. As you can imagine, the bigger the number, the more advanced the clinical trial is, and the more advanced the drug is in its development. Phase 1 clinical trials are usually first in human clinical trials, where they test a drug that looks promising, and really they're just trying to find the right dose for the patient. And then phase 2 clinical trials are usually single-arm studies. Everyone gets the same drug. There's usually not a comparator drug. Sometimes there is. They just want to see, is there some sort of signal of efficacy or not? Phase 3 clinical trials are the most common clinical trials that most of our patients encounter. And phase 3 clinical trials are, okay, well, we saw in phase 1 and phase 2 some interesting data. Now we want to really rigorously compare it to our standard of care to see if it's any better. Because if it's not any better, we shouldn't approve it. We shouldn't pay for it. We shouldn't give it to our patients. We shouldn't make them suffer through the side effects if it's not actually helpful. So we really want to be sure that these drugs are good for our patients. So a phase 3 clinical trial randomizes patients between the new drug or the new intervention versus the standard of care. So for example, if the standard of care is drug B or sunitinib, for example, and you're testing a new drug such as cabozantinib, for example, then you would have a phase 3 randomized controlled trial of half of the people getting the drug cabozantinib and half of the people getting the drug sunitinib. So that's a phase 3 randomized controlled trial. A phase 4 clinical trial, usually you won't hear much about these trials, or usually they're not called phase 4 clinical trials, but a lot of them are related to drug access, to get people access to drugs that aren't available yet. A lot of them are looking at safety profiles to get more and more patients on that drug. And usually phase 4 clinical trials are after the FDA or Health Canada have already approved this drug. So really we're just trying to gain more information about quality of life and how well this drug is tolerated and how do we treat the side effects. So that's phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials. Clinical trials are really strict. They come with a lot of rules and a lot of regulations. Usually clinical trial protocols are this thick with 200 pages and we have to read through it every time, so they're quite complicated. Clinical trials are very strict and they have very strict eligibility criteria. What this means is that not everyone can be on a clinical trial, or at least each clinical trial is looking for a very specific type of individual. And so there are these inclusion-exclusion criteria. So for example, if you have very, very bad heart disease, or if you had very, very bad brain metastases that aren't controlled, those are some examples that I can think of off the top of my head, you might not be eligible for the clinical trial. We'll still consider you for the trial, but in the end, they might not be able to enroll you if you do have those issues. And the reason they want to do that is they want to make the population in their clinical trial as homogeneous as possible, as alike as possible, and so that we're not comparing apples to oranges, we're comparing apples to apples. So that's the reason why these eligibility criteria are really strict. So we have a group of people here. We've got blue people, orange people, green people, purple people, all sorts of people with kidney cancer. And they're eligible for clinical trials. And if they sign up for a clinical trial, they're randomized or registered. That's what this R stands for. And if it's a phase 1 or phase 2 trial, they'll all get drug A. If it's a phase 3 trial or a randomized phase 2 trial, there's usually a comparison, drug A versus drug B. There could even be 3 arms to the trial, drug A versus drug B versus standard of care or placebo. And I'll show you some examples at the end of my talk. All of these patients are followed during the clinical trial with CT scans to determine whether or not their cancer is responding to the drug or not. And we're also documenting side effects. And of course, what's really important is quality of life. So we're documenting that as well. There are other definitions that I wanted to float by you because that are specific to kidney cancer. So there are many different types of kidney cancer patients, and people are at different stages. We just heard that there are 67% of you have metastatic disease, while about 20–30% of you have stage 1, 2, or 3 disease. And so there's quite a wide variety, there's quite a spectrum of kidney cancer patients. So we have patients that are getting surgery, and those surgery patients, they have clinical trials that are before surgery, so pre-surgical clinical trials. They have clinical trials that are adjuvant clinical trials, so where you have localized kidney cancer, stage 1 or stage 2 kidney cancer, where we've taken it out. And what adjuvant means, it is this jargon word that we use for trying to cure you more. So can we give you something that makes your cure rate better than it already is? So we think we've cured you, but you have a chance of recurrence, but can we reduce that risk of recurrence more? And that's where adjuvant clinical trials come in, and we can talk more about that later in the discussion. And then for metastatic disease where the cancer has already spread, we have first line, second line, third line, fourth line clinical trials for metastatic kidney cancer. And simply what that means, first line means this is the very first drug you've ever taken for metastatic kidney cancer. Second line means, okay, you already used the first line drug and it worked for a while, but it stopped working, so now we're moving on to the second line. And then third line means, okay, we've already used the first and second line drugs, now we need a third line drug. And so there are clinical trials for each individual scenario. So there are some very specific things we have to look at for eligibility criteria, and there could be a trial for each individual, we just have to look for them for you. So I think clinical trials are super important because that's how we advance this field. That's how we get new drugs into clinic. That's how we get new new breakthroughs. And when you see press releases about new drugs being positive, the only way that they could do that was through a clinical trial. So clinical trials are in humans with kidney cancer. So when you read about different studies online on the internet about your kidney cancer, make sure that you're looking at clinical trials in humans with kidney cancers. So Petri dish studies are not good enough, or pancreatic cancers, that does not apply to kidney cancer. These trials in humans with kidney cancers are the only way to discover and develop new techniques and drugs by eliminating biases and making sure that it works for most patients instead of just having individual positive anecdotes. And I just wanted to talk about anecdotes a little bit. And so we have patients all the time where they're surrounded by loved ones. And of course, the loved ones want to help these patients as much as possible. So the patients and the caregivers get flooded with all this information from the internet, or I heard my aunt took this elixir and she felt better, or I heard this vitamin was actually really good, I should take that, maybe you should take that too. So you get a lot of advice, unsolicited advice, and it's out of love, it's not out of malice or being annoying or anything, it's totally out of love and caring. And you hear a lot of these stories, anecdotes, and websites. And so the problem is you don't know if it's actually going to help you or not. So it might have helped Aunt Georgina, but it might not help you. And so how do we know if it's going to help you or not? And that's where clinical trials come in. So we take these individual anecdotes and we study them and say, okay, we randomize people to this drug, Auntie Georgina's drug, versus placebo or whatever to confirm the efficacy. Because what we don't want to do is to get you to use someone else's drug where it's not confirmed that it's actually going to help you. All right, because it can actually dangerously harm you, including things that might be very unassuming, like vitamins or minerals. They could actually harm you. So a good example that I always quote my patients is in prostate cancer. A lot of people thought that to prevent prostate cancer, if you took 2 vitamins and minerals, something called vitamin E and selenium, that it would actually be good. So they studied that in a randomized controlled trial where half of the people got vitamin E and selenium and half of them didn't. And unfortunately, it showed that people that got the vitamin E and selenium actually had an increased risk of prostate cancer and did not do as well. And so individual anecdotes and these vitamin vitamins that might be harmless or thought of as being harmless could be actually very harmful. So we have to be very wary of that and be very careful how we choose our drugs. And that's why clinical trials are so important. So I want to talk a little bit about sources of bias in clinical trials. Okay, so what does bias mean? You know, when you do a study, any sort of study, there could be some sort of unconscious bias where you might actually favor the cool arm or the interventional arm, the new investigational drug, the sexy drug, over the standard of care. And that's why we have to try to eliminate those sources of bias as much as possible. So, you know, this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek picture here. These are a bunch of university students writing an exam, and look, they're all cheating. And so bias is sort of a way of cheating science. It's sort of a way of saying, unconsciously cheating science. And so an example of that is, for example, if you had an unblinded clinical trial. So let's say you had an unblinded clinical trial, you were taking sexy drug A versus unsexy drug B because it's the old drug. People on sexy drug A might actually feel better because they're excited that they're on this drug. The doctor might actually be more excited because he or she thinks that it'll be very effective. And so you actually get more attention. You might actually feel better. You might actually start exercising because you think you're getting the sexy drug. Those are all sources of bias that contribute to the contribute to the study making the sexy drug look better, unconsciously, of course. And we don't mean to make it look better. We want the truth. And so that's why we choose to blind people, or we choose to have placebo-controlled trials, so that we remove those sources of bias, so that really what we're comparing is drug A versus drug B, or drug A versus standard of care, or drug A versus placebo, and nothing in between. Okay, so we need to clean those trials up as much as possible, and that's why you see things like blinding, randomization, and placebos sometimes. So how do clinical trials work? Let's say you wanted to do a clinical trial. How do they work? So, well, it starts with you, actually, the patient. It comes from the patient. You ask about clinical trials. Oftentimes, oncologists and urologists have clinical trials, but maybe they're too busy and they can't think about clinical trials all the time. And so if you ask about clinical trials, then the oncologist can talk to you about the trials that are available in your setting at your center. You're given an informed consent form. This is a consent form. It's usually 30 pages or so that talks about why we're doing the clinical trial, what the clinical trial does, what drugs the clinical trial compares, whether or not there's a placebo, whether or not there are any harms to reproduction, whether or not you have to come in for different blood tests or CT scans. And so it'll give you all of that information there. Then, you know, you're told about the alternatives. What if I don't do the clinical trial? What will you give me instead? You're talked about the logistics. You know, here are the clinical trials nurses. You meet them, and you talk about the pros and cons of doing the clinical trial. You're given ample time to review it. It should never be a pressured situation. You should always feel that it's a voluntary decision to participate in a clinical trial. And if you decide to join, then you can sign the consent form with the doctor that you're with. You're given a photocopy of the consent form to take home with you. And you need to know that consent and participation in the clinical trial can always be withdrawn by you at any time. So if you decide to participate in a clinical trial, at any time you can say, you know what, I've actually had enough, or actually, I'm good, let's stop. Then absolutely, it's within your right to stop. Once you sign up for a clinical trial, then you enter a screening phase. And what the screening phase is, it's a phase where we determine whether or not you truly are eligible for the clinical trial. Because if you remember, there are lots of different rules in clinical trials. Yes, you're eligible. No, you're not. There's like usually 30 criteria that you have to fulfill to see whether or not you are able to fit in the clinical trial or not. You have to repeat CT scans, do blood work, you do physical exams, and you have your screening visit. And then you're registered or randomized, and the computer does that, not us. So we don't have any say as to which arm you get chosen to. If it's a blinded trial, you won't know which arm you're assigned to. If it's an open label trial, then you will know which arm you're assigned to. We continue your treatment and monitor your progress with blood work and CT scans. As long as things are going well, if your tumor is shrinking or if it's stable, then we continue. If your tumor is growing or if there are bad side effects, then we stop. And of course, you can choose to stop at any time. There are different pros and cons to clinical trials, and it totally depends on what clinical trial you're talking about. But in general, I tried to construct this pros and cons chart to be a bit general. So in general, the pros of doing the clinical trial is it's your chance, it's your opportunity to try the most cutting edge technology, be it a certain type of surgery or a certain type of radiation or drug that other people, it's not available yet to other people because we're still trying to study it to see if it works or not. But I'll tell you, most of my patients, my longest living patients, have been on a clinical trial, and they're still on that clinical trial because it's an effective drug, and they started that drug long before it was even FDA or Health Canada approved. The cons, though, there may be new side effects that we don't know about, and so that's why we're studying them and trying to compare whether or not it's worth those side effects for the given efficacy that the drug gives. A pro of the clinical trial is that you get close clinical follow-up. So there are more visits. You see the clinical trials nurses more often. You see us doctors more often. So people see that we're paying more attention. Not to say that non-clinical trials patients don't get attention, but because the protocols in the clinical trial require us to see you so often, you'll actually get more follow-up visits because the clinical trial requires it. The con of that, though, is more parking, more driving, more commuting, more battling people for parking. You know, in Calgary, it's very difficult, and costs. Some clinical trials reimburse parking. Some clinical trials reimburse long distance travel, and so you can ask your investigators about that. And of course, there's inconvenience. So you have to think about, you know, can you drive there all the time, or can your loved one drive you there all the time, or will it be too inconvenient? Another pro is that you may get access to another line of therapy. So in the kidney cancer world, for metastatic kidney cancer, the government will usually only fund 2 or 3 drugs for you. And so once you're done that third drug, the government doesn't fund any more of these drugs, and these drugs can be very expensive. So doing a clinical trial may potentially insert an extra drug into your treatment algorithm, into your treatment sequence, so that you actually get access to more lines of therapy, because on clinical trials, drugs are free. The investigational drugs are free, sorry. And a con of this, though, is it may or may not help you. So the reason why we're doing the clinical trial is we think it might work. It looks like it's very promising, but we want to double check. And so there's a chance that that double check turns out that no, that drug actually doesn't work. And so, so if that happens, then at least you've helped patients like you in the future. There are lots of clinical trials available. These are just some examples of clinical trials. So we have some immuno-oncology agents that are for first-line metastatic kidney cancer, where the kidney cancer is already spread. And it's first-line, meaning you've never taken any drugs for metastatic kidney cancer before. And look at all the different trials that we could go on. There was this Checkmate 214 study looking at these drugs versus this drug. This Emotion 151 study looking at this drug versus this drug. I want to point out to you that this Checkmate 214 study here, it was already reported. All of the patients were already accrued. We already have the results to this, and it was actually shown to be better. So ipilimumab and nivolumab was shown to be better in a very select group of patients, so something called intermediate or poor risk patients. And so this is an example of how doing clinical trials has advanced the field of metastatic kidney cancer. The patients that have enrolled in this trial have helped patients in the future by making this combination become available for future patients. This Emotion 151 trial is also completed, and it'll be reporting out soon, in the next week actually, at GUASCO in San Francisco. And there are also other combination studies, cabozantinib, ipilimumab, nivolumab. There's this combination here of lenvatinib, everolimus. There's axitinib plus avulimab, axitinib, pembrolizumab. There are tons of clinical trials, and really this chart, this graphic here, is just to show you the breadth of how many clinical trials there are across the country and around the world. And I think Canada actually has very, very good access to clinical trials for kidney cancer. How do you know if a clinical trial is available for you in your region? So clinicaltrials.gov is really helpful. The problem with clinicaltrials.gov, though, is you might get way too much information than you actually want. And so, you know, you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can search for renal cell carcinoma. So it's better to search for renal cell carcinoma instead of kidney cancer, because the medical term for kidney cancer is usually renal cell carcinoma. You could say you want it in Canada. You could say you even want it in Calgary. And if you click search, then what you get is this list of all of the different clinical trials that we're doing here in Calgary. So there's the Javelin clinical trial, which has already finished, and so it's not as updated on this website. There's this radiation clinical trial. There's this new compound versus axitinib in metastatic renal cell carcinoma. So there are lots of different trials available, and you can search it by location and by disease type. There's also Kidney Cancer Canada. Kidney Cancer Canada is an amazing source of information. It's a great resource. There's so much peer support. There's blogs. There's people with kidney cancer on drugs that you probably are on, and can give you their experiences and let you know where to go for more information and who to talk to. But they also have a link. If you click on patients and caregivers and in clinical trials, you'll get a list of these clinical trials, and they have diagnostic clinical trials, prognostic clinical trials, active surveillance clinical trials for all stages of kidney cancer, really. There are diagnostic clinical trials. You can expand this bulletin and you'll get these diagnostic clinical trials where they look at different types of ultrasound to diagnose your kidney cancer. And so there's a lot of information, and the best part about this website is it's all Canadian and it's updated religiously. It's really, really well looked after. So I think Kidney Cancer Canada would be a great source of information about clinical trials. The last thing that I want to do is just sort of run over some myths, some things that I hear very often, and I just want to sort of dispel them and also address them as well. So I used to hear this a lot. I don't hear this as much anymore, but people said, I don't want to be a lab rat. I don't want to do clinical trials. And so first of all, we think your patients are humans and they're not rats, and you're not in a lab. You're free to roam around. You can go grocery shopping, go to the movies and stuff like that. And people don't poke you and inject you and prod you like you're an alien. You're treated like a human being. But really, until we can cure metastatic kidney cancer, we really need these studies to try to advance the field as much as possible. The second myth that I hear a lot is that clinical trials are only about drugs. Well, that's not true. We have clinical trials about radiation. We have clinical trials about should we do surgery or not. So there are lots of clinical trials investigating, is treatment A, be it a drug, be it surgery, be it radiation, be it active surveillance, is that better than treatment B? The third myth that I want to talk about is, you know, I'm a patient with kidney cancer. I can wait until a later stage of my disease to try a clinical trial. I'll just do the tried, trusted, and true medications for now. And absolutely, that's definitely very reasonable to say, you know, I want to use something that's approved by Health Canada or FDA approved first and see if that works. But I want to point out that even if you haven't tried any drugs before, you can still sign up to do a clinical trial, because the standard of care arm will be those tried, tested, and true drugs that are already FDA and Health Canada approved. And so in most of our trials, everyone gets something, and so no one is given nothing, especially in metastatic disease clinical trials. And finally, the last one is, I live far away or I'm in a remote area, so I cannot participate in a clinical trial. And you know, that can be true. So if you live 1,000 kilometers away from a major center that has clinical trials, it may be infeasible to do a clinical trial. But I've had kidney cancer patients drive in from Grand Prairie to Calgary, and that's an 8-hour drive. I have people from Saskatchewan drive into Calgary, and so it is doable. And some clinical trials will actually pay for a portion of the travel costs, like airfare, gas, mileage, stuff like that. Not all clinical trials do that, but that's something to ask people about. And so if you are interested about clinical trials, feel free to ask your oncologist, you know, do you have clinical trials? And if you don't have one for me, is there another center that does have one if you're interested in participating in clinical trials? Clinical trial participation is always voluntary, always voluntary. And so if you didn't want to participate in one, that's completely fine. So why do we do clinical trials? It's not because, you know, it's not because I get kicks out of doing clinical trials, because I should show you my inbox. It's got a whole ton of paperwork about clinical trials. That doesn't make me happy. But why we do clinical trials is because we want this future potential here. Like, look at these future drugs that we can bring in, and look and see how we can extend patients' lives, make patients' quality of life better. And that's the reason why we do clinical trials. We also do clinical trials to give access, give our patients access to drugs that they might not have access to otherwise. But really, it's about the future. It's for helping patients in the future. It's for helping present patients to try new drugs that'll be groundbreaking for the future. So I wanted to end there and say thank you for your participation and thank you for coming on board. I know there are many other things you could be doing on a Tuesday night, but I also wanted to thank all the patients, all the family members. I've had literally hundreds of patients sign up for clinical trials, and I just want to thank all of them and their families, their caregivers, for investing the time, the effort, and the heart into clinical trials to discover better things for the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Heng. We will just introduce now Deb Maskens, who is going to be joining us now with the patient perspective. Deb is joining us from Guelph, Ontario today. So, Deb, if I could get you to turn on your camera, we will get to your questions very, very shortly. And Deb, I wondered if you could just give a bit about the patient perspective. And Deb is also sits on the board of the International Kidney Cancer Coalition, and is one of the co-founders of Kidney Cancer Canada. And we think clinical trials are very important to moving forward to ensure that patients have options and that we can extend their lives. And so I wanted to bring Deb on today to talk a little bit about clinical trials. She's been on a clinical trial for sure. And Deb, just give briefly your take on the work of these clinical trials.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Dr. Heng, for an excellent overview presentation. And I can see we have a whole lot of people on the presentation who will have questions. So I'll try to keep these comments brief. First of all, personally, I've actually been on 2 clinical trials myself. I'm a patient with metastatic papillary renal cell carcinoma, and I've been metastatic for 21 years, I think now. So when Dr. Heng talks about the success of clinical trials, I would like to say that some of my longevity has been thanks to the experts that I have been able to amass for my care, and that has included 2 trials. So I live in Ontario in Guelph, and I've chosen to have my care always in an expert center for RCC, and that's my own personal bias when we talk about biases, that I have given up the luxury of being treated locally, and I have entertained the 401 and the $26 a day parking at my center, but that's worth it because I'm here today, and I really believe in the future of kidney cancer through the research. So I've been at this a long time. I first joined a clinical trial in about 2006 at Princess Margaret in Toronto. That was a phase 3 trial that led to the approval of sorafenib, which most people have never heard of in kidney cancer anymore. So it's an approved drug, Nexavar. It was the first one in Health Canada. And those of us who are on that trial were the very first people involved in Kidney Cancer Canada. Hey, we've got to get this drug approved because we're actually living longer. And that was my first trial experience. I had a bit of a rough time on the drug. It was more toxic than I would like, but I had tremendous expert support. So I had an amazing introduction to clinical trials. And so when my cancer recurred again, as it's like to do, I immediately looked for another clinical trial. And in this case, because my kidney cancer is very rare, there wasn't actually a trial in Canada. So I found a trial through my own resources online. I found a trial at the MCI in just outside of Washington, and I was able to find out about that trial and then bring that trial to my oncologist and say, what do you think about this for me? And what's really important that I want to share with other people is not to expect for your own oncologist, no matter how brilliant they are, to know about all of the trials that you personally might be eligible for or be interested in, because no one ever thought that I would actually be willing to go to the NIH and to join a study. But this was particularly for my kind of disease, and so I did that study for 3 years. That was a phase 2 open label study. It was a c-MET inhibitor, and it actually never came to market, even though it worked for me for 3 years, but it was one of the predecessor drugs to cabozantinib. So the drug I was on was called XL880, the cabozantinib then became XL184, and it came to market. So I'd like to think that I had something to do with cabozantinib, although, you know, that's just me talking. But overall, I'd like to say the care that I had on a clinical trial was the very best of care. There wasn't a single thing that went on with me that somebody wasn't following. Yes, there were more appointments, and yes, I had to write my blood pressure down twice a day, and I had to report whenever anything happened that, you know, I have a headache, I have this, I have that. But beyond that reporting, it was a phenomenal experience. In fact, to the extent that coming off of the trial is a little bit tough, because then you're just back in the regular system again, and you realize that you don't have quite that surround sound care that you have on a clinical trial. And so online on the discussion forum with Kidney Cancer Canada, I'm active on there, answering most times to people's posts and really encouraging people to think about a clinical trial. Ask your doctor, but actually take the onus on yourself and call Kidney Cancer Canada. And if your doctor doesn't know, maybe somebody at Kidney Cancer Canada actually knows. There's a trial across town that you could join, or maybe in the province that's beside you. And if it's for a clinical trial, we can help navigate that for you. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to contribute to any of the perspectives on questions. But Dr. Danny Heng, he's the expert here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Deb. Appreciate your thought. We'll get Dr. Heng to come back on. It's time for questions. As you can see from the slide on the screen, please type your question into the chat window, and we will try to go through these questions as quickly as we can, and we will ask you as much as we can. So starting off, this one for Dr. Heng, what is the nivolumab versus ipilimumab clinical trial about? Great talk, full of information, and really appreciate your explaining. Can you talk about the Nivo and the IPI trial?
Sure. So it's very new information, and in fact, it's so new it hasn't been published yet. So it's really important that we know that it's really new, and we really haven't had time to really interrogate this data very well. But basically, patients with what's called intermediate or poor risk disease, if they had ipilimumab and nivolumab, which are both IV treatments, and they super rev up your immune system so that your immune system attacks the tumor. If you use that instead of sunitinib, you actually get better outcomes. There are certain things about it though. So, you know, for favorable risk disease, the opposite happens. Sunitinib is actually better. And in terms of side effects, there are some new side effects with the ipilimumab and nivolumab combination. And so some immune-mediated side effects that may be difficult to tolerate for some patients. And so these drugs are not for everyone. They're actually not available yet in Canada. We hope that they'll be available through a special access program soon, but it's some really new and exciting information.
Next question is, patients do not have a good way to compare the information from various drug trials. They may not know how to compare their own status against the patient group, or if they are likely to be eligible. They may also not understand how many trials may be available. Is there a phone number that might be available, or other kind of information where they can seek the response to that question, that knowledge?
You know, we're in the information world. There's information everywhere. It's all over the internet, and it can be very confusing. And, you know, I think your doctor can help. And so if you bring some things that you're wondering about, I think doctors are receptive. Some doctors are receptive to going over and explaining it. I think it would be helpful to hear from Deb, though, because she's actually had to sort through a whole bunch of information, and ask Deb what her sources were that she used.
Mm-hmm. I think we use all of the sources. So Kidney Cancer Canada, I was just back and forth with Mona today. The list on the Kidney Cancer Canada website is current as of today. It doesn't get any better than that. But for each patient to navigate, I think for the first thing the patient needs to understand is what subtype do you have? Because everything depends upon that. So do you have clear cell renal cell carcinoma, or do you have something else? And if you have something else, you really, really want to be thinking about clinical trials. But knowing what your subtype is, and that's in your pathology report, that's a key driver for how you're going to navigate clinical trials. And if the language of eligibility criteria is confusing, and it is, you know, are you ECOG 0 or ECOG 1? And, you know, on a good day, are you 0? And sometimes you feel like a 2. Like, some of that language is really, really difficult, and it's on clinicaltrials.gov. It's not really intended for patients. So I would say to call Kidney Cancer Canada, say you're interested in a clinical trial, and get somebody to walk you through, because it's really different in every individual case. And it will depend upon how many other lines of treatment you've had. And so I know Dr. Heng mentioned this in his presentation, but far too often I hear patients saying, well, I'm going to do the standard therapies because they're easier, you know, I can just take the prescription and off I go. But once you've had 1 or 2 lines of therapies, like me, I've been on 2 drugs already. It's really hard to find a trial that will take you if you've already had 2 drugs. So you want to be as fresh as possible. The trial language says treatment naive. I would suggest that we are never naive as patients, but your most options are going to be if you haven't had any drugs yet. Okay. And then the field is wide open, and all of those trials that Dr. Heng showed are options for you.
We are running tight for time. Can we run just a few minutes over? Is that possible? Okay. Is gene therapy the new frontier in renal cell carcinoma treatment?
That's a great question. Gene therapy still has a way to go. So there are some new things like CAR T-cell therapy and some in vitro, so in the test tube, experiments like dealing with DNA and splicing out things of DNA. The difficulty with them is that they sound really exciting, but they must be studied further. So even though something is really exciting and sexy, we've been hit by this many times before. If it's really exciting and sexy, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll work. And so we have many more studies that we need to do to see whether or not they work. So there are studies around the world looking at different things, specifically for CAR T-cell therapy. There are some studies in China, for example, one in the US, but they're very small, very, very small clinical trials that are single arm. They're not even phase 3 randomized controlled trials yet, because we're not ready for that yet.
If Connie asks, if you're an older age, should you, it's a negative question, but should you not look into trials? So I guess the question really is, if you're of an older age, are you eligible for trials?
I love my old patients. You know, some of the pros of older patients is that they're usually retired, they have more time, and they can do a clinical trial. I wouldn't say that age alone is a reason to exclude yourself from a clinical trial. We definitely have 75-year-olds on clinical trials, and that's okay, because the point is not that you're 75, the point is that you're a human being and that we need to treat you with the best drugs possible.
Okay. Yep. This from Mike. He says, I could not participate in a clinical trial in Ottawa because I had a previous autoimmune disease. Would that prevent me from other trials?
That's a great question. The reason why autoimmune diseases are not allowed in clinical trials of immunotherapy is because if we rev up your immune system, it's going to make your autoimmune disease much worse. So we don't want to do that. And so there are other clinical trials. So for example, I can think of an antibody drug conjugate trial that some Ontario sites have opened that compare it against axitinib. You've had to have at least 2 prior therapies beforehand. So there are trials available. You just have to go fishing a little bit more.
Okay. Do most clinical trials require a biopsy, and how is the biopsy done?
That's a great question. I would say some clinical trials require a new biopsy. So there was one recent clinical trial, the Javelin clinical trial, where your biopsy had to be a year old or less. But I would say for the most part, your original kidney cancer surgery from 5 years ago or 7 years ago is usually good enough, but it just depends on the clinical trial. The reason why some clinical trials want fresh specimens is because they want to be able to look at different biomarkers to tease out, are you the person that's going to respond, or is this person the person that's going to respond based on those biomarkers?
Great. Deb, did your doctor help you get into the trial that you found yourself? And what happens if your doctor doesn't want to help? Are there other ways you can get involved in a trial?
Yes, my doctor actually said, this looks pretty interesting. Would you leave this with me? And I'll make a phone call to the principal investigator so that we can talk doctor to doctor. And I appreciate that because there's this whole language that doctors like to use. And then when she came back to me and she said, you know, Deb, I think that this is a plausible idea for you. And she reminded me that, you know, if it's too tough on you, you can withdraw at any time. And so I always knew that going into this, that I could stop at any time if it was too onerous in terms of the appointments and travel. It was one trial where all of my travel was completely paid for. So I had excellent care. I just had to give it that extra time. And if my doctor hadn't been willing, I would have found another doctor. I would have called Kidney Cancer Canada.
Are stage 4 patients, Dr. Heng, who have not taken any medication-based treatments generally more eligible for trials than those currently or previously on treatments?
Yeah, so alluding to Deb's comments, the sooner you start with clinical trials, the more you're eligible for. So we have first-line trials, second-line trials, third-line trials. So if you start with a first-line trial, you'll be eligible for a second-line trial. You'll be eligible for a third-line trial. But if you do your standard of care therapies first-line and second-line, then you'll only be eligible for a third-line clinical trial.
Are most doctors, this is another question on that, but do you think most doctors are open to patients joining a clinical trial? I was at a meeting the other day, and we were talking about clinical trials with an investigator, and the investigator said one of the biggest challenges is actually getting some of the doctors to do that referral or to sit down and talk with their patients.
That's a great question, Stephen. Doctors are busy, urologists are busy, they've got huge clinic lists, and unfortunately sometimes clinical trials aren't on the top of their minds as they should be. And so sometimes it's important for patients to advocate for themselves and say, what about clinical trials, and sort of open that dialogue and discussion yourself, especially if it's something that you're interested in.
When a renal cell carcinoma tumor is removed by surgery, is it ever tested to find out what caused the cancer?
Oh, that's $1 million magical question that I'll never be able to answer. Unfortunately, most of the time it's due to bad luck. Sometimes there are genetic abnormalities that are inherited, but and there's some risk factors here and there as well that help contribute to it. But it's $1 million question.
Because I know there's been a lot of discussion about genetics, medications, exposure to chemicals, smoking. I mean, there are the risk factors for kidney cancer, which is, I'm sure that most of the people that are on the webinar today have looked them up to find out why they may have kidney cancer. So, has there been any direct causal link between, say, chemicals and kidney cancer?
There are, but they're not, it's not so good that we could say if you are exposed to chemical A, for sure you're going to get kidney cancer. So that link doesn't exist. There are all little associations, and they're all weak associations, like certain industries are associated with it. Definitely genetic abnormalities are associated. Smoking is also always associated with cancers. But there isn't anything except for VHL mutations or heritable kidney cancer mutations that are directly linked, that you can blame it on that you got your kidney cancer.
Okay. Another question. Are Canadian trials offered in the U.S.? We get this question a lot, Dr. Heng, about patients finding studies in the U.S., for instance, and saying, why isn't the study available here in Canada? And that can be always a challenge to try to explain that, or even to sometimes try to find centers that may be offering or may possibly be recruiting.
Yeah. There are many reasons for that. Usually clinical trials are worldwide, especially the big clinical trials. So usually the big US clinical trials, we usually have them in Canada as well. When it comes to really small niche studies, patients, very small studies that only require 20 patients or 30 patients, you don't need the whole world to accrue to that trial. And so we like to centralize that experience in one location. And it's better to do that than to spread it all out all over the place. Clinical trials are really expensive to run. They use a lot of resources. It's a lot of paperwork. You should see my inbox. And so we have to make sure we focus those resources on big clinical trials that make impact. And if there are clinical trials that someone's eligible for and they want to go there, absolutely we can send a referral over there because that would be a center of excellence. You'd have to pay for it on your own. You'd have to fund it on your own, but it is doable.
One of the questions that we had this past month on a clinical trial is a patient had a 4-centimeter tumor, had it removed surgically, and then afterwards was asked, or actually even before the tumor was removed, if he would go on an adjuvant study here in Canada. And of course the question becomes then, well, why would I put myself through a year of possible side effects and treatments if I don't have to?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why clinical trials are not suited for everyone. And so the specific clinical trial you're talking about is a clinical trial that we have here in Calgary too. So people who've taken out their kidney tumor and they're cured, we're trying to cure them more or make their recurrence risk less by giving them a drug. And we don't know if that drug's going to work or not. And that's the reason why we have that clinical trial. So the idea is that if you wanted to participate in science for the future, to help patients in the future know whether or not that drug is helpful or not, then please do participate in that clinical trial. If you want a chance that, let's say we do find out that that drug's really, really important, then you would have had that drug already and you're ahead of other people that didn't have access to that outside of a clinical trial. So that's the reason why a lot of people sign up for trials like this. I must say, when you tell someone that they have a 30% chance of recurrence and all we're going to do is sit and do CT scans, that's really unnerving for people. A lot of people want to do something about it. And so a clinical trial is a good way to participate in that and feel like you're doing something about it.
And
Deb, did you have any comments about that?
I'd like to chime in on that, because on the adjuvant trials in particular, that is a very difficult decision for a patient to make. It's not at all clear, and I think that's when you may want to get a couple of different opinions on that, and by all means talk to the advocates in kidney cancer trials, because there are at least 3 phase 3 adjuvant studies, and there's a fourth one that, some of them are, I think, more friendly to patients than others. But I think patients have to think this through and think there is a likelihood that their cancer will not recur. And in that case, should they put themselves through the inconvenience and potentially the harm of an agent for a year? So it's a risk-benefit equation, and I would talk to 2 physicians before I signed up for a trial like that.
Mm-hmm. Deb, I want to give you just a couple of minutes before we go about infusion of placebo trials, IV. I know because this does come up, and I think it's worth the discussion today. And the idea is that one arm would be an infusion, an IV, and then the other arm would be an infusion of just saline solution. And we've talked about this last year at the Patient and Caregiver Forum in Ottawa, but I think it's worth talking about to one, I think, put out our position on it as Kidney Cancer Canada and as advocates, and 2, to get a clinician's point of view on this as well.
Well, I've been asked to speak on something I feel very passionately about, and so first of all, I'll say I have the utmost respect to anybody who has signed up for a trial like that, and I really wish that they do well on that study. But as a patient advocate in kidney cancer, I vehemently object to any patient being subjected to intravenous saline solution, which is essentially salt water into the vein. Having an IV inserted into your arm is never pain-free, and it's not entirely without harm. And I think the companies that have brought these trials, they have heard from us as advocates at the global level and at the Canadian level that these studies should never have been designed this way. The FDA has also informed us that the FDA never told the companies that they should have designed the trials this way. In fact, the FDA gave them advice to the contrary. So I think patients have been put in a very difficult situation. They're vulnerable. They want to try to prevent a recurrence, but these studies should have been designed with patients for patients, and we must do better in the future.
Dr. Heng, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are very fair comments, and we've heard that resoundingly on Twitter, on different blogs, and it's really important to hear the patient perspective. And so, thankfully, now we actually include patient advocates in our clinical trials decision-making bodies. So, at CCTG, the Clinical Trials Research Group for Canada, for many years, I would say decades, they've had a patient advocate in the clinical trials arena. And now in the NCI, the US NCI, the National Cancer Institute, there are also patient advocates there, also trying to help in trial design. I think the difficulty is for a lone researcher here, we get what we get in terms of clinical trials. And so we actually can't, now that the trial is already formed, we actually can't change it. We could ask them to change it, but it's really up to the companies to do that. And we don't have power to do that. And so thankfully now in the future, we'll have more advocate voices and we'll be able to play a bigger role in creating those clinical trials. So a really good example is a clinical trial called, it's with nivolumab Prosper, where we give nivolumab just before you take out your kidney and then do your kidney surgery and then do a year of nivolumab versus not placebo, but nothing. All right, so that way you don't get those IV injections. So that's something that we are planning on opening up in Canada. It's been really slow to open up because it's not opened up by a drug company. It's opened up by a cooperative group mechanism. And so any help to help open those sort of trials up is greatly, greatly appreciated. And I think, and I'm just guessing, we'll have that trial open in Canada in a few months.
And we will definitely. We'll have that on the website as soon as we can. That's the end of the questions for today. But if you have any unanswered questions, you can certainly go on to kidneycancercanada.ca and click on Ask the Expert, and that's where we put some of the answers to your questions, or you can also email us as well. Today's webinar will be at kidneycancercanada.ca. You can also go there to look at past patient meetings. And if you want, we we have some free information for you from the handout section on your screen. You can get a printout of today's slides, the clinical trial in kidney cancer. That's located under the handouts there. And a couple of notes. We do need more volunteers and community ambassadors across the country, so please do go to kidneycancercanada.ca and sign up. We are trying to build a national community of community ambassadors and volunteers so that we can, have volunteers in clinics such as Dr. Heng's clinic when he's doing that, so that we can talk about the materials and resources that are available and some of the upcoming webinars and also meetings that we have available. When you leave today's survey, which will be in a couple of minutes, please do complete the survey that you get as you log out about your experience with today's webinar, because that will allow us to improve them in the future. If it was convenient, the information that was contained, we'd like to see that. And also, I just want to remind you, obviously, if you're joining the webinar today, you get the first note on Saturday, May the 5th in Toronto is going to be our National Patient and Caregiver Forum, a National Patient and Caregiver Forum that will be held in Toronto on May the 5th. So stay tuned for the details and the registration slides that are coming up there. And I want to thank Dr. Daniel Heng, who joining us from Calgary, for his presentation today. Much, much appreciated. Thanks very much, Dr. Heng. And to you as well, Deb, from Guelph, Ontario. It's a pleasure to see you again and chat with you on the webinar. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks to you for joining us, to our many friends and family across Canada. Thank you for joining us. If you want any information, if you have any questions whatsoever, there's our email address. It's on the screen, info@kidneycancercanada.ca. And our toll-free number is 1-866-598-7166. We'll leave that up on the screen for you for about 2 minutes. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great night or good morning wherever you are in the world. Thank you.